All right, well, we're going to get started with our evening session. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me to be here. I understand that I stand between you and your dinner time. So it's a tough spot to be. If you're hungry, I get to hold you hostage. So you don't get to eat until I say so. So I'm sorry, just kidding. I'll try and end in a timely fashion. I want to start with some statistics. Many of us are aware of the state of the church in the United States today. Most estimates are that there's roughly 375,000 churches in the United States as a whole. And most projections are that by 2050, which seems really far away, right? 2050, we're actually closer to that than we are to the year 2000, which seems hard to believe. But by 2050, 125,000 of those churches, or roughly 1/3 of the churches in the United States, will close their doors. Now, it's no secret to a lot of us that the state of the church in the United States has been in decline for a long time, right? We hear about declining attendance numbers, right? Declining giving, declining pastors, number of pastors in a denomination or in our denominations. And so we're kind of wondering, what is the future of the church in the United States? Maybe you have thought of that question as well. What is the future of the church as a whole? What is the future of my church or of our church? And this is kind of where my talk for this afternoon will tie in with our theme of discipleship, because I believe that the future of the church in the United States is just that, is discipleship, right? And if we have a declining number of pastors in our nation, well, then discipleship is the answer, right? Because we need to make more disciples who make disciples, and through that process, you lose me.
Yeah, I didn't. The battery's probably turn it off. Yeah.
I'm gonna try turning it back on.
Yeah, it might be just need some. Do you have batteries?
It's blinking green at me.
Let's
I don't
just
know.
change out the batteries because we're going.
Let me turn it off. Please hold.
Clear. Transport.
No longer blinking. All right, how's that? Am I back? Great. If you didn't want to hear me, too bad. All right, well, as I was saying, future of the church in the United States is discipleship. And through the process of making disciples who make disciples, we will make more pastors as well. For all of you young people sitting in the room, you are the future, really, of the church in the United States. And we need leaders in the church, right? I think any pastor or any ministry leader in the room would say we need young people to step into these leadership roles and to consider where God may be calling you into ministry in the future. I'll give a little bit of introduction about myself. So my wife and kids are out there. If you didn't see them, we like to cause a little bit of a ruckus. So my wife, she's Natalie. We have 2 kids. Our son Bowen is almost 3. And our daughter Joni is about 1.5-ish. I grew up in the Reading area originally, so I'm from Berks County. Not yet. Thank you for whoever that was. I went to Exeter High School, if that means anything to any of you. And we've been pastoring, or I've been pastoring in Lancaster County in this area for about 4 years now. So my wife and I moved down in September of 2022. Now, we were originally called to a church called California EC Church, which is in Morgantown. And if you're wondering, why is it called California EC Church? If it's in Morgantown, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's on a road called California Road, which is basically where the church gets its name from. But a couple of years into our ministry at California, we expanded and also added Bridgeville to my charge. So I'm full-time pastor at California, part-time pastor at a church called Bridgeville, which is in Narvon. If any of you have been to Shady Maple, yes. Bridgeville is close to Shady Maple. So there you go. And then roughly a year after that, we added Peckway EC Church to us as well, which is on 340 in Lancaster County, if that means anything to you. Now, I'll talk in some kind of abstract terms here, right? I live in the church world, church organization world, church structure world. But think about these things that I talk about. We're going to be talking about networking as discipleship. Think about these things in terms of your world as well, right? You might not be a pastor, but you do have an area of ministry that you've been called by God to be a steward of, right? So think about these things. Think about networking as discipleship in your own world, whatever that may be. Now, maybe you're wondering, how does a pastor handle 3 churches? Right? That seems like a very large undertaking. Tanner, how do you do that? And the simple answer to that question is really that I don't. And that seems maybe like a cop-out, but I do in partnership with our church leadership teams and what we call our shared preaching team. So between the 3 churches, I don't do all of the preaching at those 3 churches. We have a rotating team of preachers who rotate through the 3. I form the schedule, and we have a weekly rhythm that we follow that I'll talk more about in my breakout session next tomorrow. But really, it's myself in partnership with other leaders. You see, I used to think that discipleship was something that you did to a person, right? Like, I disciple you, right? And we might think, right, discipleship happens in a conversation over coffee, or we think that discipleship is a curriculum that you lead a person through. But I've come to believe in my own leadership in the church is that discipleship is something that a church is built around. Not just something that a church does or a program that a church runs, but that discipleship can be the organizing structure of a church. And really the story of how these 3 churches became a network of churches is really the story of that conviction in me being tested, being clarified, and holding up under scrutiny. Now, I want to tell you a little bit of how the story of that network of churches came to be. And it starts, oddly enough, as a part of my own personal testimony. And this is going back long before the churches ever became a network. Now, as a kid, I grew up in the church. I was raised going to church every Sunday, and I went to summer camp as a kid at a camp called Twin Pines up in the Poconos. It's affiliated with our denomination. I saw a head nod. Someone knows what Twin Pines is. That's great. And you might wonder, well, what does that week of summer camp have to do with this network of churches? Well, it's an important part of my testimony because when I truly began to follow Jesus, I heard God's call to go and to serve at Twin Pines as a summer camp counselor. Now, God's call for me to turn and to follow him came through what was really a return to my roots, right? Those seeds were planted at Twin Pines those summers as a kid when I was there. And God's call came through me returning to Twin Pines, to something that had been formative in my life growing up, to seeds that had been planted by faithful people long ago. And, I think about the people that led those summer camps, or the kids that were there with me, right? They had no idea of the impact that their ministry would have until years down the road. Now, it was through Twin Pines that I met a man by the name of Kirk Wolf, Pastor Kirk Wolf. He's a pastor in our denomination, and he directed a summer camp called Martial Arts Camp over the summers when I was there. My childhood best friend, who I had reconnected with as a part of my testimony and coming to faith in Jesus Christ, would go on to marry Kirk's daughter. So there's some neat connections along the way. Now, Kirk was the pastor at Bridgeville EC Church, one of the churches that is now a part of our network. A friend of mine named Josh, who had worked with me at Twin Pines, would go on to serve at Bridgeville EC Church as their youth pastor for a time. And I would go to visit him every once in a while, right? I would help out with some of the different youth events that he was running and attending, some of their outdoor worship services and those kind of things. Now, all of that was long before I was ever called into ministry. All of that happened long before I came to California to serve as their pastor. But when I came to California, I was paying attention. I knew that this church was close by, it was close to Bridgeville. I knew that those events from my testimony were not an accident. And I knew that God had been weaving all of these things together in my life, placed me in each of those places, in each of those relationships for a reason. It was only with hindsight that it became clear that God had been leading me to this place and doing all of this in my life. Maybe you think about your life as it is now, and you think, well, my life is just a connection of disconnected events, right? And, whatever I choose to do may not really matter, right? But I can tell you, as someone looking back, that those things are not random, right? There's no coincidence with God, I always say. God is weaving your story together. And so pay attention to the ways in which God may be leading you into relationships or into circumstances. Now, I share all of that to tell you that discipleship, as I said, is not simply meeting with a person over coffee. That discipleship is not merely leading that small group or that Bible study that you may be involved in, but that discipleship is a lifestyle. That discipleship is all of life for us, right? If you are a disciple of Jesus Christ, then discipleship is something that you do, right? It's a natural outpouring of your identity as a disciple of Jesus. Almost like how a runner is a person who runs, right? If a person didn't run, then we couldn't call them a runner. Or how a carpenter is a person who does carpentry, right? If a person didn't do carpentry, then we can't call them a carpenter, right? So it is with a disciple. A disciple is someone who does discipleship, and if you don't do discipleship, then we have to wonder, are we a disciple? See, and a disciple must pay attention to the circumstances of their life. And so Austin did this earlier, and so I want to pause here in my story, and I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I want you to answer two questions. First, I want you to answer, what are the places that God has placed you in? Think about maybe your testimony, maybe the course of your life. Those are the places that you're called to make disciples in. So, what are the places that God has placed you in? And second, who are the people that God has placed in your life? Because those are the people that you are called to make disciples of. So turn to the person next to you and answer those two questions. We'll pause here for a couple minutes, and then we'll dive back in. So anything stand out to you from your conversations with one another? Anything that you want to share of a place that God has placed you in, or a person that God has placed in your life? Well, I asked those questions and would encourage you to continue asking those questions, because the places that God has placed you in, right, those are the places that you are called to make disciples in. And the people that God has placed in your life, those are the people that God has called you to make disciples of. It's really that simple, I think. Sometimes we think about our calling as, this grand thing, and I need to go to, this place in order to do ministry. But really the heart of our church network is, well, what is the ministry that God has for us here, and how can we do ministry here? And I think sometimes we have, that kind of narrow view of our lives, but discipleship first requires us to take that step back and to look at the big picture of what God is doing in our lives and how God has been at work among us. And so here's where it connects to our network of churches as well, is that I think if that's true for us as individuals, and if the church is made up of individuals, then it's true for the church as well. Right? A church must pay attention to the circumstances that it finds itself in. The church is near it, right? As we did, the leaders that are connected to it, as I mentioned, and the people that God has placed in our communities within our reach. Right? Those things aren't distractions from the mission. They are the mission of our church. And as our network expands, right, the people that we're called to reach expands, and the potential for us to make disciples expands as well. So that's, my own personal side of the story, and part of my own personal testimony. I want to give you as well some of the details and the events of how exactly the network came to be as it is today. Now, I knew that Bridgeville EC Church was close to us, and I was keeping tabs on the things that were happening there. It's our sister church. They're close by. When I came to California, I noticed a couple of things that as a pastor I was really paying attention to. So the first thing was that when I came to California, most churches, when they go through a pastoral transition, they bring in outside pastors to fill their pulpit, right? Let's reach out to some retired pastors, maybe some pastors who don't have a church that they're at right now. And one of the things that I noticed about California was that there were three lay preachers, just members of the congregation, members of the leadership of the church, that had filled the pulpit over the summer before my wife and I came to the church. Now, when I got to the church, I said, that's an amazing thing, right? How many churches would love to say that, there were three leaders from among themselves who stepped up, saw a need, and met it, right? And so, I could have come into the church and said, well, all right, thank you for filling in. And now it's going to be the Tanner show. And so you're never going to have an opportunity to do that again. But I noticed, and I felt God leading me in this direction of, these are men that need to be raised up, right? Clearly they have gifts. Maybe they need to be honed a little bit. But part of my role as a pastor was not just to do all of the preaching on a Sunday morning, but to raise up other men, other leaders to preach as well. Now, one of those men, his name is Chris. Chris is one of those people, maybe you've had this experience as well, who is just a real go-getter, right? Chris actually reached out to me and basically said to me, hey, Tanner, can you disciple me? Can we go out for breakfast? Can you pour into my life, right? I want to do these things. I, felt God saying to me over the summer before you came that, maybe God wants me to go into pastoral ministry as well. So Chris, me and him began to meet. I began to pour into his life. Chris is now a part of our preaching team, as I mentioned earlier. But it was actually Chris, as I was discipling him, and he, following the Spirit's leading on his own, that began to reach out to Bridgeville, our neighboring church. They had these men's breakfasts, and he would go and just be there to listen to the people. And it was Chris actually at first, and not myself, who caught wind of the things that weren't maybe going so great at that church. And they eventually had a pastoral search that dragged on for some time. And we, again, observing from outside, realized that things were beginning to deteriorate a little bit. And we reached out to help, not because we had a strategic plan for growth, not because we wanted to grab a hold of their ministry and take over, but because our default posture as a church had become, who is God putting in front of us, rather than, well, how do we protect what we have or grow what we have? And that's what I mean by discipleship as a network, or networking as discipleship, is that this way of thinking shapes how a church makes decisions. Right? When you filter everything that a church does through this lens, it becomes less about us and our church and becomes more about, well, what churches are close to us and how can we partner with them, not just for our sake, but for the sake of the kingdom as a whole. So I reached out and had breakfast with their ministry council president, who I didn't really know. At the time, I mostly just wanted to get to know him and see how things were going. That meeting went really well. Our next step was to set up a meeting with myself and with a few members of their leadership team. That meeting went well also. And I remember, I had become overwhelmed at first with this task, right? Of, well, how do I get these churches to partner together, right? That's a very big undertaking. I remember early on, I read about a pastor who had led churches through this kind of thing before, and his approach was rather simple. He said, pursue it fervently, but not desperately. Push for it, but hold it with an open hand. Keep taking that next step forward in faithfulness as long as the doors in front of you continue to open. And if nothing, I think that's what discipleship is, not just in a church context, but also for us as individuals. Now, as the doors continued to open, what we did was our two churches decided to set up a trial period, right? So I would lend my aid to Bridgeville. I would preach there at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And then California would push their service back from 10:15 to 10:30. And then after I preached at Bridgeville, I would then go over to California and I would preach there. And, one of the things that amazed me throughout the whole process was that California was just so accommodating, right? I was their pastor, and they very easily could have said, well, hey, Tanner, you're our pastor, so we're not going to let you go and preach at this other church, right? But they held me with an open hand and willingly allowed me to share my time with Bridgeville. But we noticed along the way that we didn't just want to share a pastor between churches, that we were always looking for more ways to deepen the partnership. And so one of the things that we began to do was we began to hold these joint worship services. So we figured, hey, we're two churches. Instead of having one service or two services, let's have one service. Let's meet together at 10 a.m. at Bridgeville at the beginning of the summer and at California at the end of the summer. And so we started to do that. We began to formalize the partnership as well. So instead of me just lending my help to Bridgeville, I became employed by Bridgeville. And each step seemed small on its own as we took them, but each one flowed from that same posture of paying attention to what God is doing. And all along the way, with each step, the churches enjoyed being together. It became less of one church helping another and more of just people doing ministry together. In January of this year, earlier this year, the churches held a joint board retreat. And I got both of the leadership teams together. And we had done some surveys of both congregations. And we met together on a retreat with the goal of hearing from God what his direction was for our churches moving forward. And we felt from that meeting that it was best to pursue a church merger. We would become, instead of two churches meeting in two locations, we would become one church that meets in two locations. So each location would keep their place, but we would merge the organization together. We formed what's called a feasibility team to explore what that could look like, and we continue to meet. We're hoping to have a plan to present to both congregations for a vote in January of 2027. Now, to wrap all of this together, if that merger and this partnership between these churches shows what it looks like when a church's posture changes a little bit, right? When it changes from, well, what about us to what about you, right? And I think that's a lot of what discipleship is. See, one thing that we noticed pretty early on is that this network couldn't be completely dependent upon me as the sole leader. This became especially clear to us when we added a third church as I mentioned when we opened onto the network, Peckway, earlier this year. And those three men that I mentioned earlier, we actually added a fourth. A man and his family began attending California. And those men have those untapped preaching gifts, as I mentioned. Right, it was time for me to give them more of just being a second choice, someone to fill in when I wasn't there, and instead to give them a place of prominence, right, to use their God-given gifts for the sake of the church and to fulfill the calling that God had placed on their own lives. Again, we'll talk about this more in my breakout session for tomorrow. But that preaching team, I think, is the clearest picture for us of what networking as discipleship actually looks like, right? That difference that happens between a church where the pastor preaches and everything else is a workaround, and a church that's structured from the ground up to multiply disciples, to multiply disciple makers and preachers as a result. It's been beautiful to see this in action, right? Not just for me as a pastor from the preaching perspective, but from that discipleship perspective of people who have been not just learning to preach, but who have been growing as disciples of Jesus Christ. Now I want to pause here, and I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I want you to answer another question. So the question I want you to answer, in light of our church network and how we've been working together, how can you, in that place that God has placed you, in those people, right, that God has called you to make disciples of, how can you make disciple making not just part of an addition to something that you do, right, a part of something that you do, maybe a program attached to something that you do, but how can you make disciple making, right, the structure, the foundation, the heart of what it is that you do? So turn to the person next to you and answer that question. Yes, yeah. It's kind of like what Austin was talking about earlier when he talked about in conversation with people, not just listening to them, but also listening to God, right? And what is it that God might want to say to them, right? And following his leading through those parts of it. Could be a conversation, right? Could be something that you're doing, right? Yeah. It's amazing too how contagious that kind of thing is too, right? Like when you're living your own life from that heart or from that posture, right? Other people see that and they catch on, right? And it becomes that network like we're talking about, right? Like kind of how in my story it's, from myself to our lay preachers, right? And then passing on from them to other people, right? So yeah, it's good. Right. Yes. Yeah. All right. Anyone else want to share something from their group? All right, great. I'm going to wrap us up here quick, and then I'll open it up to any questions that you might have. Now, so, thinking about our network of churches, right, you wonder, and I am wondering as well, because we're not on the other end of it, right? We're still in the midst of it. What is it that we hope will come out of our network of churches, right? And I think the answer to that is, obviously we hope that more disciples will come from our network of churches, right? Disciples who make disciples. But I think we also want to prove to other churches and to just the church at large that really a church's structure will either bottleneck discipleship or it will allow it to flourish, right? If there's a pastor who holds on to every sermon, every decision, every relationship, right, there will always be a cap on what the church can become. But a church that's built to release what God has planted there in its people, in the partnerships and the relationships and the leadership, right, that's a church that is built to multiply, right? That's what the network is, right, at its core, is disciples who make disciples who make disciples. My hope for our church network is, yes, that we will continue to grow. Yes, for our sake, but also just for the revitalization of hurting churches in our area, but also in the rest of our country and the rest of our world, right? I shared as I opened some pretty bleak statistics about the future of the church in the United States. It's my belief and our church network's belief that that can be reversed, right? And we think that it's through that reversal that it will come through these networks of churches, right? Churches partnering together, not being so focused on themselves, but being focused on each other. So I'll close with that. Tim, do we have a couple of minutes for questions? All right, great. What questions do you have? Could be about the church network, could be about me, could be about anything. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Tim.
So we have 3 different locations. How do you keep your relationships tight with your different congregations?
Yeah, do you mean like with the members
Yeah.
at each church? Yes. Well, I think part of the answer to that answered in 2 parts. So the first answer, I think, is that I have to be, like we said, very intentional about it, right? So I'm always thinking about, at each church, right, who are the people that I need to reach out to that week, right? So I'm always paying attention on Sunday, and we track this as churches of, well, who's missing, right? And maybe I should have said our churches are all kind of small, right? We're under 50 people on a Sunday morning. And so it's pretty easy to tell who's missing on a Sunday morning, right? So that's kind of the first thing that I pay attention to is like, well, who's missing? Maybe second, who's struggling? And then as I'm evaluating that as a pastor, I try and schedule time to either make a phone call or a visit to those people throughout the week. So it would be very easy for me if I wasn't intentional about it to miss people because my time is split among the churches. I think the second answer to that question is that I also have to realize it's not just my responsibility to keep those relationships up. Like, yes, I'm the pastor and I try and be involved in the life of every person. But as I'm raising up leaders and making disciples in our church, right, I'm also equipping them to care for each other, right? So I have to realize, hey, I can't care for every individual soul in our network of churches. Like, I'm going to miss people. But are there people in our churches that can care for one another and then placing them in those positions to do so? So that answers your question. Yes.
What would you say has been your greatest challenge and also your greatest victory in that
Yeah. So greatest challenge and greatest victory. I would say the greatest challenge for me, I think I expected the greatest challenge to be like the decision making and the leadership teams trying to get them to work together, right? That's actually been fairly easy. I think the biggest challenge has been, and I think a lot of pastors have this struggle of trying to work in the ministry while also working on the ministry, right? So, like I have things that I need to do every week, like sermon preparation or visits, like I said, or those kind of things. And it's very easy to get wrapped up in like what they call the tyranny of the urgent rather than what's important, right? So, that kind of balance of like, well, there are still things that I need to do, like tangible responsibilities that I need to take care of, while also trying to improve what it is that we're doing and lead the church through that process. So I think balancing those two things has been the greatest challenge. I think the biggest victory has just been seeing the churches rally around each other and also rally around, the preaching team and some of the leaders that have been raised up. I expected a lot of like territorialism, right? This is our church, this is your church, like, and that kind of thing. But when they're together, they're one church, right? And they're supporting one another and loving one another. So that's probably been the biggest thing. So, yeah, good question. Yeah, thank you. All right. Anything else? Questions?
So
Yeah, good.
What's the leadership structure looking like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. His question was, when they merge together, what is the leadership structure going to look like? So we're still in process trying to answer that question. What I called our feasibility team has been answering that question. What we've arrived at is that we still want to preserve some sort of local decision making at each location, right? Even though we're moving to, you can think of it kind of like a multi-site model, right? So we are going to have a centralized leadership team that kind of oversees all the locations in the network. But we still want to have some local ministry teams involved. So kind of what we're thinking is that we'll allow those leadership teams at each location to be focused on ministry of the church, right? And not to bog them down with some of the more administrative things, and to allow the more centralized leadership team to handle those things. So, yeah. So I guess kind of the officers would be that centralized leadership team, and then the more ministry focused roles, think of like a ministry council, they would stay local. So, yeah. Good question. Yes.
You find it difficult to balance family leadership and leading three congregations?
Yes. He asked if I find it difficult to balance family and 3 locations. The answer to that is yes. I answered the biggest challenge being, what I said earlier, but I mean, paired with that, it's also family as well. It's been a time of really difficult. Like my time is wrapped up in these churches and in these things, and it's very easy to, as a pastor, right, focus on church life instead of family life. And so I've very much had to evaluate my life and to realize that, my wife and my kids, they're my first area of ministry, right? And they're who I need to pay attention to first and foremost. And if I'm not doing a good job of stewarding that area of my life, then I'm not going to do a good job of stewarding the church ministry either. So probably the biggest thing is before all this started, I was involved. I was one of those people that's like, I have to be involved in everything, right? And maybe you get some of that from the story that I shared. But I've really had to pare back things in my life of like, well, what's really important for me to be involved in? And where can I focus my time? Because if I find that I'm being spread too thin across all these different areas, right, then I only have a little bit of myself to give to each area. So, Tim asked me earlier if I had been up to Twin Pines this summer because, I had led summer camps there. I worked there as a counselor, but then I became a director. And this summer we just said, hey, we're going to take a break from being up there for the summer. So really the things that I'm focused on right now in my life is my family and this church network. And it's a really busy season, but we're hoping that once we get through it and the merger happens and things are kind of figured out, that I can kind of take a step back and have a slower pace of life. So there's seasons to life. Some are busier than others, right? This is a busy season. And if I'm not paying attention to my own spiritual health, very easy to fall into that burnout. So, yeah, good question.
Maybe with that, with the balance of family and ministry, there's always a question, what ministry stuff is my family with me on, and what stuff do I go without them? Does your family go to the same church as you every Sunday? Every church with you every Sunday? Or
Yes.
what's the church look like for your family as you're doing multi-ministry?
Right. Yeah, great question. So he asked if my family goes with me to everything, to which the answer is no. So some Sundays they go with me to multiple churches. Some Sundays they don't. Really, that's dependent on how they're doing, right, and what they need. But the churches have been so gracious to say, like, hey, we don't expect your wife and kids to be at everything, right? So, and that's something that I've communicated to them as well. Like, they can't be at everything. So they're very gracious in that way. So not only do our churches have joint meetings, but their pastoral relations committee, they meet together as well. So that's the group kind of tasked with making sure that the pastor and his family are okay. And they've done a really good job of saying, hey, how can we care for you? How can we care for your family? What do you need? And so people from those groups have stepped in to help us with babysitting or things in the parsonage where we live or other things. So, obviously there's a lot of pressure on me, but our churches have done a good job to not put all that pressure on my wife and kids as well. So it's all good. Yeah. All right. Anything else? Yeah.
How do you balance paying such close attention to what God put in place in front of you, while also giving attention and love to those people and situations that you already have? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Right. So how do you kind of handle the opportunities that God has placed in front of you that you could pursue versus what God has in front of you right now? Is that your question?
More, if I'm doing something,
Right.
but I'm also watching for something God could be placing in front of me and keeping that eye out in his head. How do I both pay attention to what could be coming and give my full attention to, or I guess not full, but give the love and attention to what I am doing?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good question. Well, I think it becomes almost like you have to prioritize, right? And I think, you can think of it kind of like triage, right? In terms of like a hospital, right? So someone comes into a hospital, right? They have a broken leg, right? That hurts, but they don't need to be treated before the person that's bleeding out, right? So you treat the person that's bleeding out first, and then you treat the person with a broken leg. That's how I would kind of think about it, right? Keep that open mind of like what opportunities that you could pursue are out there. But first priority is whatever is right in front of you, right? Whether that's a person or a ministry that you're involved in, right? Pour yourself into that as much as you can. And if something else comes up, another opportunity, right, you can pursue that. And I think maybe as well, one part of that might be, well, is there a way that if there's another opportunity, I can release myself from this area of ministry to go and pursue this, right? Like if I'm discipling someone, for example, and I really want to pour myself into this person that I'm discipling, and then another person comes up and I'm like, oh, I have to split my time between the two. Well, maybe this person is at a point where I can release them. I've invested in their life up until this point. Maybe I can release them and send them off to do something else, and then I can invest in this person as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think we're pretty much at time here, so thank you all for having me. I'll be back tomorrow for my breakout. And